on soldiers' wisdom and hope. But I never noticed any bitterness or spiritual cracks in any one of them, or any hostility toward military discipline. Twardowski, like no one else, captured these special strands of the peasant spirit, and through this insight he successfully composed his poem about Vasily Tyorkin. I read this poem several times to the soldiers, and they would ask to hear it over and over again. The average soldier accepted the character of Tyorkin as his own comrade and brother. I was often present at soldiers' conversations, and took part in many of these manly little talks, as I affectionately called them. I noticed that most often in these tales of home, the light of hope was present in all their dear ones and families, the hope that the war would soon end, and that things would change for the better. "I have a son, he's literate, the first one in the village," a conversation started. "After serving in the army, he remained in the city, studied to become an engineer, and now we're putting our trust in him." In all these conversational beginnings, a latent question was detectable. What will our life be like in the future? Probably it is precisely this hope and this humility before the elements that lies at the secret of the peasant's forgiveness and impassive attitude toward authority, toward the war, and toward all the other adversities and sudden turns of life. It is the hope that even these would pass, and somehow everything would change for the better, with some eventual gain emerging from all the current pain and suffering. The soldier's aphorisms. Any sort of social intercourse can be instructive, but to what end? I've already told you about my first day at the front and my encounter with Uncle Kuzia, when I developed the idea of jotting down the advice of experienced soldiers after I burned my diary. Day after day, in the dugouts, directly in the trenches, in the field, in the woods, often around a campfire, I collected bits and pieces of a soldier's wisdom. I can't remember a single case when someone declined a friendly conversation. That's how an entire manuscript arose, which I entitled A Compilation of the Soldier's Rules of Conduct. I didn't try to hide my undertaking, and I often read my notes to young commanders and new recruits. Nonetheless, to protect myself and deflect any hostile critics, I started my compilation with a bunch of Red Army slogans about proper obedience and behaviour in battle. Despite my precautionary measure, one day, having heard about this eccentric officer who was collecting aphorisms, a high-ranking commissar summoned me. After flipping through a dozen pages, he gave a smirk. "People will learn how to fight even without your scribblings, so I advise you to occupy yourself with something more useful. Your direct responsibilities are to spend more time at the front, to inspire the warriors, and get them to rise into the attack. So go do it, and no more conceits." What stupidity! In the German army, any soldier, not to mention officers or generals, could keep a diary. I found out about this, understandably, much later, but at the time I kept quiet. However, there were a lot of unflattering things said about this party grandee. This fool had reached the point where he forced new party members among the soldiers in the front-line trenches to make their way from the front line to the rear to obtain their party card, sometimes under direct fire. I finally calmed down when the divisional newspaper printed a dozen rules from my compilation under the heading Words of Advice from Experienced Frontline Soldiers, from the Frontline Notes of Captain Ch. The division command read the article. Some praised it, others held their tongues, and some, as was usually the case, had a laugh. Unfortunately, my labour of many years burned up during a fire in the Count's castle, where the division staff was located. This occurred in Hungary on the 12th of November 1945, on my birthday. I've since forgotten much of what I had written then, but all the same, I was able to recreate some of it by memory as an example of that which helped me and other soldiers survive. A compilation of the Soldier's Rules of Conduct. Soldier's Rules of Conduct. 1. Take care of your honour from youth. 2. Never forget the oath you've taken. 3. Guard your unit's combat banner, guidon or colours with your life. 4. An order from the command is the law. 5. Don't discuss an order, carry it out. 6. Don't argue with the command. It is like spitting into the wind. 7. Don't be caught by a commander who is in an angry mood. 8. Don't take a step on enemy territory without permission from command. 9. There's no complaining in the army. 10. Strive to put one past the commanders, but you'd better not get caught. 11. Guard your commanding officer. Die if you must in doing so, but rescue a comrade. 12. Help out old soldiers and new recruits as much as you can. 13. Preserve frontline comradeliness. 14. Remember the feeling of fellowship. 15. Forget the bad, but always remember the good. 16. Don't do anything thoughtless. 17. Don't ignore the advice of experienced soldiers. 18. Don't eat anything salty or sweet before a march. 19. Don't stuff your belly before a battle. Try to limit your intake. 20. Always keep a couple of bread morsels and a flask of water in reserve. 21. He who has a little tobacco is the man who has a holiday waiting for him. 22. To eat to your fill is just as important as having reliable cover. 23. Learn to eat and sleep on the move and in any weather. 24. If you're wounded, don't be afraid of the blood. 25. Don't catch your own bullet in battle. 26. Remember, a bullet flies more quickly than you can react. 27. In a combat situation, forget about shame. Nobody will judge you. 28. Don't ever yield to panic in battle and suppress your fears. 29. Don't rely upon your eyes and ears. They can trick you. 30. Kill the adversary. Otherwise, the adversary will finish you off. 31. Learn to hate the enemy. Without hatred, you won't overcome him. 32. Don't shoot prisoners. 33. Don't read enemy leaflets. 34. Don't praise the adversary and don't believe his cunning speeches. 35. Don't pass along rumours and gossip. Cut them off. 36. Don't hope that the adversary will forgive your inexperience. 37. Don't keep personal notes at the front. 38. Learn to hold your tongue. 39. Don't confide anything to an unknown person. 40. Search for, find and use your own ingenuity in battle. 41. Get used to difficulties. Don't walk away from them, but overcome them. 42. Any success requires endurance and patience. 43. Become friends with the earth. It's your best friend in combat. 44. Find some cover from enemy fire even on flat ground. 45. Strive as much as possible and wherever possible to deceive the enemy. 46. Don't miss an opportunity. 47. The lazy soldier is a burden to all. 48. Remember Suvorov's principle. Each soldier must know and understand how to behave in combat situations. 49. Bullets see no differences between ranks. 50. There is nothing more pleasing than when someone fires at you and misses. 51. Always treat everyone else the same and be prepared to come to their assistance. 52. Carry out an order responsibly, never relying on the off chance that it may be rescinded or become unnecessary. 53. Remember, it is not what you are doing that is important, but how you do it. 54. If you've given your word, keep it no matter what it might cost you. 55. If you meet a woman, don't let the chance slip to celebrate life. Another chance may not come along. On reconnaissance. On the evening of the 9th of July, the column of Studebakers reached the highway leading to the Neman. It is approximately 230 kilometres, 143 miles, from Minsk to the Neman River. If you took the highway directly and without halts, it was 2 days of travel. It took us nearly 5 days to reach the river. The first truck of our column had just pulled out onto the highway when the men aboard it spotted a parked string of vehicles about 300 metres ahead down the road. Who were they? Ours or theirs? Our column stopped. Colonel Kudryavtsev sent forward some scouts. "Germans," they reported, returning. "A few tanks and 5 or 6 vehicles with infantry." "Reverse, into the forest," came the command. The trucks turned around, and soon we came upon an alternate forest road leading to the river. Our scouts told us that the Germans had paid no attention to our departure, plainly supposing that we were Germans trying to catch up with our own unit. At the approach to the river, we spotted a forester's lodge. "Are there Germans around?" Kudryavtsev asked an old man who emerged. "The Germans were here. It was yesterday," the old man replied. "They blew up the bridge and left, over that way toward Grodno." Then he added, "But if someone wants to get across, there's a way. There's a large, strong raft nearby. The Germans left it behind in 1941. It will support both vehicles and guns." What luck! As it turned out, it was the only way to get across. That night, the entire battalion crossed the river using the raft. As a covering force, the colonel left one gun and a squad of soldiers behind by the forest road, where it exited down to the river. Once on the opposite shore, we rolled the trucks and remaining 45mm guns a little farther from the bank and camouflaged them. The first order of business was to determine the strength of the adversary confronting us and what his plans were, whether he was intending to continue his retreat or was trying to dig in and turn the Niemen into a new defensive barrier. The enemy airplanes left us alone and rushed to attack the pontoon. Under constant shell fire and bombing attacks from the enemy, the sappers completed a new bridge, but toward evening it was demolished by bombs. After the initial bombing and the preparatory artillery fire, enemy submachine gunners launched an attack upon us, supported by machine gun fire from self-propelled guns positioned at the bottom of the hill. The attack shook us, and Colonel Kudryavtsev was mortally wounded early in the fight, but Zakhar Diudin, who replaced the fallen Kudryavtsev, rallied us to counterattack. Tossing grenades at the attackers, we managed to hurl them back off the hill. Battalion Komsorg Pavel Bernikov received a concussion, and fragments from a nearby exploding shell severely wounded Diudin. The Deputy Commander for Political Affairs, Grigory Mishinsky, replaced him. The opening bombardment had knocked out our 45mm guns, and all of our machine guns were gradually put out of action. The situation grew precarious. The adversary was trying to hurl us back into the Neman, whatever the cost. One day remained until the division's arrival, just one day. We had to hold out until at least the forward regiment arrived. We had to endure. We had to hold on. Just then, the enemy again made a rush at us. None of us was thinking about heroism, nor were we thinking about death. The remnants of our battalion strove at whatever price to resist the enemy's onslaught. As the sun began to set, the Deputy Commander for Political Affairs sent me a note. I was urgently to ferry the severely wounded across to the opposite bank, locate the approaching 376th Rifle Regiment, and inform them of our serious situation, so that through our combined efforts we might force the Germans to abandon the heights they had occupied. I clambered down the hill to the riverbank, found the raft that had been concealed in the lee of a sharp bend in the river, and hauled it to where the wounded were located. There were 12 of them, including Zakhar Diudin and Pasha Bernikov. Together with a surgeon's assistant and 2 medics, we neatly loaded all the wounded onto the raft, then carried aboard the body of Colonel Kudryavtsev and floated across to the opposite shore. Scouts from the 376th Rifle Regiment met us there, and the wounded men were immediately transferred into the care of doctors from the Medsanbat. The regiment prepared to cross, but there was not a single boat or log to be found. So men from the regiment dismantled empty huts and quickly built rafts from the material. The regiment's party organizer, Captain Kirill Koshman, was the first to cross aboard our raft, together with about 20 men. We were old acquaintances and rejoiced at our meeting. As we crossed the river, I tried to explain the mobile battalion's situation precisely and quickly. "Understood," Koshman said as he drew his pistol from his holster. "We won't waste any time. They're waiting for us. You stay here and report everything to the regiment commander. We must urgently prepare to receive more wounded. We'll have to ferry them across during the night. You must find the commander of the anti-tank battalion and advise him where best to deploy his guns. Mark the location of the enemy-held heights on their maps. At dawn, we'll set about taking them. If necessary, we'll need the support of rocket launchers. Until we've established radio communications, I ask you to stay with the regiment commander." Koshman was a fearless man, full of initiative. Leading his detachment of men, he immediately headed for the hilltop positions. During the night, I saw to the evacuation of 16 more wounded men. The main body of the 376th Rifle Regiment began crossing the Neman. I spent the entire day with the regiment, ensuring that everything Koshman had requested was carried out. On that day, for the first time, I saw how human hatred and combat rage were stronger than the fear of death. The warriors leaped from their rafts, and without pausing even a minute, rushed forward, streaming around the flanks of the enemy-held heights. These were soldiers who had passed through long-suffering Belorussia, and what they had seen there was even more terrible than what they had witnessed at Vyazma, Rzhev, or around Smolensk. They came under enemy fire, but there was no force on earth that could have stopped them. By the end of the day, the situation had sharply changed. On the night of the 16th of July, Grodno had fallen, and the rest of the 220th Rifle Division was moving to our assistance, as Gugev, the commander of the 376th Rifle Regiment, informed me. Having given up Grodno, the Germans began to retreat hastily, abandoning equipment along their way. They also abandoned the heights that loomed over our bridgehead. Our Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack planes appeared above the Niemen and hunted down the panicked fleeing enemy forces. Exactly a day after the liberation of Grodno, on the 17th of July 1944, tens of thousands of Germans, who had set out toward Moscow in 1941, finally completed their march there, not as conquerors but under escort as prisoners. More than 52,000 of them were captured in the early days of Operation Bagration and were marched along the Sadovoy Ring Road under the gaze of passers-by. My parents soon wrote to me about the impressions that Moscow's citizens had as they watched the prisoners march past. For the liberation of Grodno, the 220th Rifle Division was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. Battalion Commander Zakhar Diudin and Battalion Komsorg Pavel Bernikov received the same honour. The party organiser of the 376th Rifle Regiment, Kirill Koshman, was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union for his role in forcing the Niemen River. They decorated me with the Order of the Patriotic War, first degree. After the war, finding myself in Minsk, I visited the Belarusian Museum of the Great Patriotic War. There I saw documents about our mobile battalion, which had defended the Niemen bridgehead. As soon as the battle for our bridgehead ended, our mobile battalion was disbanded, though, strictly speaking, there was hardly anyone left to disband. But our 220th Rifle Division was already moving farther west. Brushing aside several covering forces along our way, at 8 p.m. on the 17th of July 1944, our division reached the national border. It was a special day and hour for each person who was lucky enough to experience this historic moment. Yet this literally historic event was occurring on the very same day when the captured Germans had been marched through Moscow in disgrace. Coincidences are astonishing, and there seems to be something enigmatic about them. Reconnaissance troops, scouting ahead of our main force, were the first to reach the national border. Out of breath, one of them ran back to meet the marching column of our division, shouting, "The border! The border! Ura-ah!" The column sped ahead, and then we all came to an abrupt halt. That strip of land, called the border, lay before our common gaze. At first all of us, soldiers and officers, quietly took in that which had always seemed so menacing and unattainable, something that people had always sensed to be strongly and permanently defended. Literally like crazy men, we looked all around, asking the same questions. Where were those traditional attributes we always associated with the Soviet border? Where was the barbed wire? Where were the long, deep ditches that separate two countries? Where, finally, were the border markers and guard towers? What of the barriers? There was none of this. It had all disappeared somewhere. Later we learned that the residents of the nearest village had wanted to carry off the dismantled border markers for firewood, but the local authorities had refused them permission, possibly foreseeing that they might be needed again one day. We even saw them, these symbols of the border, lying next to a patch of woods, arranged in neat stacks, awaiting their renewed life. The border! How many times had artists painted it? How many songs and verses had poets and composers created about it? As school kids, we had tried to forget the song drilled into our heads. The borders of the Soviet Union. He has closed to the black ravens, he has garbed them in concrete and stone, and forged them in cast iron. So let us sing the song, comrades, about the greatest sentry who sees and hears all. Let us sing the song about Stalin. We wanted to forget these lyrics as quickly as possible. But now each of us sensed with our entire being the greatness of what we were experiencing. We knew it was a special moment in our lives. In 1929, as a young man, the party mobilized me and sent me to a village to organize the collectivization work there. The very first day after I finished my gallant speeches, the peasant men gave me such a thrashing that to this day I'm a little deaf in my right ear. 2 more officers were sitting in the room at a table, upon which was spread a map. The general introduced us. Colonel Lobachev Kirill Afanasovich, the division chief of staff. We've been fighting together since the Moscow battles, and this young major is Lavushka Rapoport. He's our assistant to the division chief of operations. He's my Shafirov, a reference to Petr Pavlovich Shafirov, 1670–1739, famous Russian statesman under Peter the Great and chief translator in the Russian Foreign Office for many years, renowned for his knowledge of foreign languages. I hope you know your Russian history? As the general talked, I began liking him more and more, his openness, simplicity, and sincerity. The star of the Hero of the Soviet Union medal, which he had received for the Belarusian operation, was gleaming on his field blouse, along with 3 orders of the Red Banner and the Order of Suvorov. But in addition to his chest, his entire mouth was shining with gold. I thought to myself, how strange, he doesn't seem to be an old man. The general burst out laughing. I see, Senior Lieutenant, that my gold teeth have surprised you more than my medals. Isn't that so? That's true, I confirmed, embarrassed. It's a memento of those years, when in 1937 Komsomol members at the prison knocked out all my teeth, just like they did to Rokossovsky. But at the same time they also broke one of my ribs and all my toes. In 1940 I was lucky, and they released me. It seems Timoshenko had put in a word for me. Now we serve under the command of Ivan Danilovich Cherniakovsky. The youngest general in the army, he's just 39 years old. He's as wise as Solomon. A military professional of the highest order, he graduated from the military academy. There aren't many of those today. The general shot a glance at the table. Do you know how to read a map? Yes, we had an excellent instructor at the specialist school. What specialist school did you attend? The Tyumen Combat Infantry School, to be a mortar platoon leader, but we never managed to complete our training. We only studied for 4 months, and then we were sent to the front. If necessary, do you know how to handle a machine gun or mortar? Absolutely. That's splendid. The 3 of us were just now trying to figure out where we might best strike the Germans. They've deployed select units on the border, and they're defending stubbornly. Our guys seized a few border settlements and villages near Gumbinnen, but couldn't hold on to them. Such a thing hasn't happened to us before. The maps are terrible. As soon as we find officers among the prisoners, we send them immediately to Lavushka so they can help him figure out where we are. And you, Komsomol member, for some reason have been stuck at the rank of senior lieutenant for quite a while. Your new post is that of a major. We'll ask Alexei Adamovich to do a little something for you. I was awarded the captain's rank in March 1945. Now we've gotten to know a bit about each other, the general concluded the conversation. If you need something, come see me. And you yourself let me know if we're neglecting something among the soldiers. The news was stunning. Already by the next day, many knew about it through the grapevine. The division commander officially announced the news. Calling together the regiment and battalion commanders, the general revealed, 23 female snipers are coming to join us. They're recent graduates from the Higher Snipers School in Moscow. Army headquarters and the chief Komsomol leader have called me and asked that I receive the team personally and ensure normal frontline conditions for them. You only have a few days before they arrive, so get ready. Then he added sternly, Remember, comrade officers, all these young women are untouchable. Whoever lays a finger on one, I'll rip off both his officer's straps and his head. Untouchable. It was necessary, but what a word to come up with. The officers took the news differently. Some ridiculed it, calling it a typical Komsomol show. Others expressed themselves tersely. "We'll take a look at these warriors. Not even a month will pass, and they'll be blown away by the wind." But everyone took the preparations for their arrival seriously. We found decent quarters for them and made the proper adjustments, taking into account the nature of the contingent. We enclosed their quarters with a high fence and installed strong locks. "We don't have enough wire for the nest," some officers joked. The autumn was cold, so we delivered warm undergarments, boots, padded jackets, padded trousers, and hats with ear flaps to their quarters. We even chose a warden for their residence. We entrusted this role to the chief of the division's bath and laundry unit, primarily because he was a teetotaler. One of the 31st Army's best snipers, Lieutenant Zora Kazimov, was appointed to command the new sniper team. The experienced sniper Nikodim Ivanovich became the team's sergeant major. On the day of arrival, the entire command turned out to greet the young women. Having left their kit bags in their quarters, and having slightly freshened themselves up from their long trip, the women formed up in the courtyard. The first woman stepped smartly out of the line and precisely reported, "Katerina from Zatsepa, senior sergeant, reporting for duty in the active army." "Natalia from Krasnaya Presnya," announced the next in line. That's how they all presented themselves, by their place of residence. All of them, with the exception of one, were from the Moscow area. Antonina from Smolensk Boulevard, inspired, tender young faces, eyes full of enthusiasm, light, shapely figures and clean boots still carrying a Moscow gleam, neat overcoats, and hair gathered up beneath their forage caps. We looked at them and were awestruck. Not a single plain-looking little thing among them. It was like a selection of fiancés, likeable and attractive. Yet why did the general think up this untouchable? Just say any enchanting word and one of these ladies will come after you, because both they and we are 19 or 20 years old. That's what many of us dreamed aloud on that day. The young women were given 2 days to rest after their trip, during which time Lieutenant Kazimov had a conversation with each and checked her ability to handle her weapon and led several group discussions. Sharing his own experience, he compared a sniper with a minesweeper, saying, "In both one case and the other there is a fatal risk. Therefore the sniper, like the minesweeper, must act with certainty, or else there will be trouble. When you go to meet the adversary, you must respect the sniper's 2 basic principles. First, the sniper must have confidence in his or her every shot. Second, shoot sparingly but accurately." Legends circulated around Lieutenant Kazimov, therefore the women listened to him attentively. Often he was saying something well known, but to them it seemed as if they were hearing it for the first time. It was plain that the commander's words inspired the women, but also caused them to reflect. Would they be able to act correctly in a real situation? Kazimov himself, on the other hand, was troubled by the fact that all the women could recite precisely, like a memorized verse, those things that constituted the sniper's craft: endurance, accurate shooting, and keen observation. "If you show patience, skill will come," the women confirmed. But at the same time, not once did any of them reveal her attitude toward the opponent with whom she would have to fight. Therefore, their commander concluded his final discussion with them with these words: "You will be shooting at a real person, but this person is our enemy, the fascist scum. Never show him any pity. As soon as you begin your combat service, the most important thing for you will be to overcome this psychological barrier as quickly as possible. This is not easy, but you must always remember, the fascist must never be allowed to walk around freely, even behind his own heavily defended lines. We must force him to sense his own unavoidable death." After these classes, Kazimov reported to General Berestov, "All the snipers are ready. I checked their knowledge of their weapon, their ability to use an optic sight, and their understanding of camouflage. They are familiar with the tactics of a sniper duel. Excuse me, Comrade General, but they are still quite young, and they haven't yet seen the enemy face to face. They don't yet understand what sort of beast he is. It is still premature to talk about their professionalism, but the women have enough patriotism, which means their ability will show up on the battlefield." Precisely, Lieutenant. Instruct them, share your experience with them. I have complete confidence in you. The most appealing aspects of this man, I believe, were his pure conscience and sense of kindness, which he never lost during the war. Evidently, the team saw these same qualities in him and valued them highly. For his part, Nikodim Ivanovich became deeply attached to the young women, seeing his own daughters in each one of them, and he felt great joy whenever he managed to do something nice for them. He experienced the death of each woman as the loss of a family member and grieved bitterly over each one. At his request, they wove wreaths of artificial flowers in the village for every funeral. Nikodim Ivanovich himself, consoling the weeping members of the team, kept telling them, "One day we won't be grieving, one day." That's how the Sergeant Major stood out in my frontline collection of Sergeant Majors. Nikodim Ivanovich did a lot to change the attitude of the men in the trenches toward the female snipers. The time did indeed come when their attitudes changed. Once that happened, the warriors in the trenches called the women sacred and felt sorry for them, especially the older soldiers. One man even offered prayers for their safety each time one of the teams went out on assignment. Upon the appearance of the snipers in the trenches, the men began to greet them, offering them their support. "That's the way, sniper girls! Shoot them, the vermin, and make it easier for us!" Relations with the officers were more complex. Just a step beyond the gates, and hungry male eyes followed their every move. The regiment commander, in whose area the snipers' quarters were located, behaved worst of all toward the women. He served notice of his passion even at their first meeting. Eventually, Tamara from Tsvetny Boulevard could no longer resist his charms. Receiving a note from the lieutenant colonel, a stately, handsome, relatively young man, with an invitation to visit the regiment headquarters, the young woman agreed, without first seeking permission for the visit from her commanding officer. The regiment commander's adjutant arrived for her that evening and secretly led her away. Someone alerted the general. "A sniper has run off!" Grabbing me to come along with him, Berestov rushed off in his car for the regiment. Once we arrived, Berestov flew at the regiment commander. "Just who are you trying to ravish? Don't you have enough of your own whores in the regiment?" "No, no!" exclaimed Tamara. "I love Sasha!" The general was surprised and stopped his scolding of the regiment commander. Amusingly, the furious lieutenant colonel ordered that the snitch who had informed on his tryst be shot if he ever showed his face around the regiment. By the way, I was that snitch. I repeatedly observed how complicated and unpredictable sniper work was. First of all, the opponent is no fool and is in no hurry to wind up in someone's sights. For the sniper, however, any blunder or the slightest mistake can result in their own death. Second, without endurance, self-confidence, and even a hunter's passion, a sniper is not yet a real sniper. Third, there were a lot of ace snipers in the German army, and their optical sights were far superior to ours. Entering the war with Russia, the Germans already had a sufficient number of well-trained marksmen in their units, while in the Red Army, the sniper movement developed, as far as I can recall, only after 1941. We had no notion of how women would conduct themselves in the sniper role. It seemed to us that in critical situations they might lose their heads. Moreover, we assumed that women were not inclined to take risks and that they probably didn't have enough endurance. But the sniper gals refuted many of our initial doubts. Time passed, more new notches began to appear on the butts of the snipers' rifles, the Germans began to whine, and the scornful attitude and conduct toward the women finally vanished completely. Try to figure out which is stronger, the whale or the elephant, the officers of the political department joked. They began to respect and love the young snipers in the division. They introduced a special atmosphere into our lives and forced many of us to wake up and see that the front was still far from the end of life. But even the young women themselves, I noticed, were changing, and they had become more serious. Soon there were 7 Fritzes on the tally sheets of our young women. There were perhaps even more, but it is not always possible to determine the results of a shot precisely. Returning from an assignment, the snipers would report, "I don't know whether I hit him or not, but the Fritz dropped." The most difficult episode was Lyuba from Sretenka's multi-hour encounter with a German sniper. Try to picture yourself one-on-one with an opponent, to turn yourself into an invisible person, to become a totally immobile object. Eyes quickly tire, the muscles of the arms and legs grow numb, and the body either becomes soaked in sweat from the heat or tries not to shiver from the cold. Sometimes fear appears. In Lyuba's case, one day while on an operation, she committed some small blunder. She grew certain that a German sniper had spotted her and was waiting for her next mistake. Lyuba froze, convinced that the slightest motion would mean a bullet to her head. She remained frozen like that until late evening, sometimes crying, but not daring to sob, feeling that she was growing so deeply rooted into the earth that she would not be able to free herself from it. Once darkness fell, Kasimov, who had stealthily approached the young woman's position, attached a rope to her ankle and dragged her back to safety. He carried her almost breathless body into a dugout, wiped her down with vodka, then gave her a couple of gulps from a flask. When she finally recovered, he led her by the arm back to the sniper's quarters. But there were also situations when neither Kasimov nor anyone else could help a sniper. A German sniper ace shot Dina from Orushaini Pereyulok through the head while she was moving. The pain of this tragedy was particularly acute. The team loved the blue-eyed young woman with the sweet, cheerful disposition and the melodious voice. She dreamed of becoming a pediatrician and wanted to cure all the children of the world from the diseases that were tormenting them. Kasimov was the first to sense that after Dina's death something very important had happened in the team, and he understood. At last, hatred and a desire for revenge had been born. "Hang on, German," Kasimov said. "Now you're going to see a real hunt." One day, Galia from Elikovskaya told me about her first shot. I had been watching for a long, long time. Then suddenly I saw him, a young German. He was sitting on a little stump, and he had kind eyes. What should I do? But of course one must not hesitate. I fired. Then I immediately regretted what I had done, and I started to cry. From that point on, Kasimov and I knew exactly that the question, "What should I do?" would not be a problem among the snipers. By order of the army, for a short period, half the sniper team was transferred to a neighbouring division. During this time I had an idea. We all understood that the young women needed a short breather, that at their age a girl's youthful heart is open wide to love, while these young women had to kill and kill again, which, you can imagine, is a far from simple burden. So I decided to arrange a surprise for them, to organise dance evenings. Of course, first I had to clear it with their commander. I went to chat with Kasimov. Sergeant Major Nikodim Ivanovich, hearing about my plans, smiled broadly and praised the idea. Kasimov reacted differently and frowned. "I'm categorically against the idea. The dances will distract them from their business, and the men will hanker over such blossoms, however hard that may be for you to believe. We might lose the team." I tried to persuade him and referred to the general, only to try to get Kasimov's consent. The lieutenant held his ground. Then I proposed a compromise version. "Let's start it, and if we find out we've made a mistake, we'll stop it." With that, the commander finally agreed. When the entire team had reassembled again, I held a komsomol meeting among them. We tallied their results. The snipers now had 15 fascists to their credit. "It seems there is a point to feeding us," one of the women shouted out. "I agree," I confirmed, "and I intend to send a report about your combat efforts back to your sniper school from which you graduated." I kept my surprise until the end of the meeting. "Starting next Saturday, we will be holding dance evenings. Officers will be coming as guests, and we have enough cavaliers for all of you. There will be music. If you invite me, I'll also come." My announcement was greeted with rejoicing. 3 of the young ladies invited me. I chose Rita, the single non-Muscovite on the team. Short and shapely, she attracted me with her soft, velvety speech and her radiant smile. It seemed to warm me all over. We really only had 3 dances with the officers, but what they were! The snipers, clearly delighted with the new atmosphere, danced with full enthusiasm, and the officers were equally pleased with the sudden access to the women's company. One of the officers remarked to me, "I didn't think that girls like that still exist." We kept the music going into the night, and I noticed a change in all of them. The atmosphere was now infused with joy and affection. It was like seeing the spring bloom once again after a long winter. The fate of Germany was no longer in doubt, and the question now was, how long would it take before the end arrived? Our leadership, the Allies and the Germans all understood this, but the latter continued to resist fanatically. The German command, disregarding losses, ordered its commanders to defend every line on the path to Germany's borders. The Soviet command, for its part, also not reckoning its losses, demanded its commanders to attack. On one of the first days of January, a heavy enemy artillery barrage suddenly began falling on the division's positions. Then, German self-propelled guns and submachine gunners quickly advanced upon the junction between two of our regiments. The foggy weather prohibited the operation of our air force, something the enemy had obviously taken into account. The Germans crushed one regiment almost immediately, but the second regiment offered stiff resistance, including an anti-tank battalion in its counterattacks. The fighting intensified and continued until late in the evening. By this time it became known that the enemy had carried out simultaneous attacks on several sectors of the 31st Army's front. It was either a reconnaissance in force or an effort to disrupt our pending offensive. An article was published in the divisional newspaper about the heroic feat of two members of a 76 mm gun crew, Ivan Skudnov and Sergei Pantyukov. With their gun, they had inflicted heavy losses on the attacking submachine gunners and held up the German attack, but the Germans were eventually able to seize the two wounded fighters. The article stated that the Germans had then savagely carved 5-pointed stars into the Russians' bodies before finishing them off with knives. Meetings of revenge were conducted in all the battalions. Soldiers and officers spoke, vowing to avenge the deaths of the two heroes. The division's chief of the political department, Colonel Shilovich, summoned me. "Drive the bodies of the two Komsomol heroes to Suwalki. They must be buried with honours." I took a junior lieutenant and 3 soldiers with me. We loaded 2 coffins onto our truck and set off. Suwalki is a small, beautiful Polish city situated 80 kilometres, about 50 miles, from Krakow. When we arrived, I left the coffins at a local hospital with the junior lieutenant and 3 soldiers for the night, while I went to meet with the local commandant and secured his promise to help with the funerals. I had some free time, so I decided to meet Major Lebedev, the editor of the army newspaper Navraga, at the enemy, who was in Suwalki at that time. Lebedev greeted me warmly, and once he learned about the purpose of my trip, he immediately requested permission to write about the 2 fallen artillerymen for his newspaper. My conversation with him made a strong impression on me. He was an intelligent, educated man, a historian by profession, who had graduated from the Moscow Pedagogical Institute. When the war started, he had been taking special classes for combat journalists. He was interested in finding out whether people read his newspaper and how officers and soldiers regarded it. I tried to answer all his questions. After some tea, Lebedev invited me to a meeting with his editorial board. He had recently returned from an army conference of political workers and was intending to report about it to his journalists. For tomorrow's edition, I want to tell you an interesting story that I heard at the conference, Major Lebedev began. You know that at the initiative of the Supreme Commander, after we cross the German border, we will be permitted to send packages home, once a month up to 10 kilograms for officers and up to 5 kilograms for soldiers. In connection with this, a member of the front's military council, Lev Meklis, said that Comrade Stalin had been interested in the question of how the soldiers would be able to gather odds and ends, not having any transport. Meklis brought to Stalin's attention his recent conversation on this subject with soldiers. Here's how one soldier reasoned. "The knapsack on my back is my transport. I'll always have 2 kilograms in it. As for the other 3, I'll get that in the next conquered town." Meklis said that the Supreme Commander was satisfied with the soldier's answer. "But now the essential matter," continued Lebedev. "Soon we will enter East Prussia. The command is concerned with how our soldiers will behave toward the civilian population. An army is a mass of living people, and each one has his or her personal score to settle with the Germans. For the last 4 years of the war, we've motivated the army under the slogan, "Death to the German occupiers." But the German people and the military criminals are not one and the same. Dr. Freud said, "The restriction of one's aggression is possibly the most serious sacrifice that society demands from an individual. In war, as we all know, it is particularly difficult to subdue human aggression." Lebedev added, "There are enough alarming signals even today in Poland. Robberies, abuses, outrages upon religious symbols, and things like that. They're even stealing from their own. The Germans brought tens of thousands of books, including many rare editions, which they had plundered from our country to Plisa. There they stored them in warehouses converted from former barracks. But then, having found out about this, Red Army units that entered the city committed outrages at the warehouses, and many valuable books were stolen. To a demand to stop their scandalous behaviour, the plunderers replied, 'We are conquerors, we're allowed to do it.' The front's military council demanded an immediate end to the thefts. In this instance it seems to have succeeded. But what might happen tomorrow when we arrive in Germany? Will the soldiers obey their officers? From everything that has been said, it is clear what is required of us. We must urgently take up the matter of correcting our propaganda." The journalists present began to complain. "They've thought of this too late. It's hardly possible to change something in motion." Lebedev turned to me. "Let's listen to the Assistant Chief for Komsomol Affairs of the 331st Rifle Division's political department. He came to Suwalki to bury 2 heroes who were killed in the most recent battle. By the way, I ask everyone who will not be busy to come to the park tomorrow at 10 a.m. for the funerals. They say that in Stalingrad, when the capitulating Germans crawled out of their burrows and formed into prisoner columns, one of our officers, pointing at the surrounding ruins, told them loudly in German, so that everyone could hear, 'Remember, when we come for you, on your soil, to your cities, we will turn them into just these sorts of ruins.' The soldier is waiting impatiently for the hour of retribution, almost unable to bear the anticipation. He is determined to get to Germany and settle old scores, despite whatever lofty appeals we might make, or even orders. Thus, the task before all of us is large and difficult. Understandable. For this, one must have a heart and the ability to commiserate, even if only with simple sympathy." Shilevich behaved strangely. Whenever he received a casualty report, he would heave a sigh and respond in the same fashion, "That's war. War, as you know, doesn't occur without sacrifices." How did he become such a lord and master, so egocentric and indifferent to human sorrow? In my opinion, this wasn't even a manifestation of arrogance, as much as it was simply indifference and personal coldness. As a man, Alexei Adamovich loved to eat tasty food, arrange better living quarters for himself, and fuss over his clothing. He often drove to the Medsanbat for health checkups. Through these things, both on occasion and without occasion, he tried to convince us, his subordinates, that he was an uncommon man of great merit. But the 2 orders of the red banner that decorated his dress coat always surprised me. What had he done to deserve them? Did the schoolteacher from Polza dream of becoming a colonel, an important political boss, of meeting personally with Comrade Stalin? That he might do great deeds, marked by the highest government honours? They say the gods smile rarely, but fate, with God's blessing, had long been shining on Shilevich. The wheel of his fortune took a sharp turn in the notorious year of 1937, when people were being led from their prison cells to be shot on a daily basis, while others were being promoted at a dizzying pace. Alexei Adamovich figured out in time that membership in the VKP-B was an indispensable condition for life success. Then he, a teacher and the sole party member in his district, was suddenly summoned to Minsk to appear before the first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Belorussia, Panteleimon Kondratovich Ponomarenko. Soon thereafter, at the personal request of Comrade Ponomarenko, he was enrolled as a student at the 6th Lenin Military Political Academy. At that time, after Stalin's purge of the General Officer Corps of the Red Army, they were accepting almost anyone into the military academies and specialist schools, violating both admission standards and many years of tradition. Shilevich was accepted as a national cadre and a representative of a new, unsullied generation. He had time to complete 3 years of study at the academy. In 1941, his class at the academy was graduated ahead of schedule with the rank of battalion commissars. All 30 graduates, at the personal request of the first secretary of the Moscow City Committee of the party, Comrade Shcherbakov, were placed at the disposal of the city committee. Comrade Shcherbakov personally received them all, and after some fiery ideological parting words, he sent them out to take positions in the People's Volunteer divisions that were forming at that time. Within 2 months, the division in which Shilevich was serving, along with many others, had been destroyed at Vyazma. Few survived those tragic days intact, and the wounded battalion commissar wound up, by chance, in a Moscow hospital. When he was discharged, fate again smiled upon him. Ponomarenko, who at that time was starting to organize the central staff of the partisan movement, took Shilevich under his wing. For an entire month, the battalion commissar trained in a special detachment. He learned how to make parachute jumps, shoot accurately, survive without food and water for extended periods, start a fire without matches, orient himself in a forest at night, and run faster than a beast. After the special training, which not everyone could endure, Shilevich assumed the identity of Prasko Shumkovich, and together with a group of Chekists, members of the Soviet secret police, he was dropped into the woods near Volyn. The battalion commissar was to activate a partisan movement in Ukraine, which at the time lagged behind partisan activity in Belorussia. Prasko Shumkovich spent 6 months in the Ukrainian forests, during which time he met legendary partisan leaders such as Kovpak and Rudnev, and helped organize several partisan units. In 1942, Shilevich returned to Moscow. He reported to Ponomarenko on the condition of the partisan movement in Ukraine and its prospects, but most important, he proposed the idea, of course claiming it was his own, of a raid by Kovpak through 18 oblasts in Belorussia and Ukraine to recruit large numbers of people into the partisan movement. Kovpak had already given his approval for a smaller raid, claiming he already had enough people, but not enough weapons. Ponomarenko was delighted by the battalion commissar's idea. After careful deliberation, Ponomarenko sent a short note to Comrade Stalin, informing him of the plan for a major raid. 3 days later, Ponomarenko and Shilevich, who now held the rank of regiment commissar, were summoned to the Kremlin. The conversation lasted 12 minutes. Regiment Commissar Shilevich gave a 5-minute report on partisan activities in Ukraine. Stalin praised him and instructed Ponomarenko to recommend the bold commissar for the Order of the Red Banner. He then gave the go-ahead for the organization of the raid and instructed that Kovpak's partisans should immediately receive supplies by airplane. For a year, Shilevich worked in the central staff of the partisan movement. He flew into Belorussia several times and secretly spent time in Minsk, where, with the help of some underground operatives, he learned of his family's death. In 1943, Shilevich was honoured with his Second Order of the Red Banner, promoted to the rank of colonel, and, at his own request, placed at the disposal of the main political directorate of the Red Army and Navy. From there, fate sent him to the 331st Rifle Division. I learned all these facts about Alexei Adamovich from an instructor in the political department, Kolya Shevchuk, who handled personnel files. How much of it is true and how much is a fabrication, I don't know. They say that the strength of a man lies in how well he can conceal his weaknesses. Shilevich didn't bother to hide his weaknesses, confident that he had earned everyone's pardon. A few words about the general, with whom I became friends, and under whose command I continued to serve until my departure from the army. He was an uncommon man. I rarely met men like him at the front. When on the attack, for example, the general loved to keep his command post moving forward. He liked to rush to his new position in his Willys, and from there he would prod his subordinate commanders by radio. "Why are you stuck? Get moving!" He never cursed, but gave every order in a strict tone, not brooking any objections. All the regiment, battalion and battery commanders knew about these games he played, and always tried to conform. At the same time, I must also pay him his due. Whenever higher command demanded a result at any price, the general agonized. In such situations he would always get together with Rappaport, spread out a map, and meticulously look for a way to accomplish the order with minimal losses. Another thing about him was amazing. Even if the division commander had been directing a battle all day, at night, Pavel Fedorovitch would inevitably invite the next scheduled lay, Naležnica, from among his personal harem to come see him. There were so many members of his harem from the division headquarters staff, radio operators, clerks, typists, that sometimes we wondered if the man ever slept. At the same time, he was intolerant of weaknesses in others. Frontline veterans know there are days when you want to forget everything, be left alone, and even cry a little. Alas, Pavel Fedorovitch didn't brook such nuances. But who among us officers and commanders could permit simple human feelings in others or ourselves during those harsh years? Probably there were not many of us. We loved and respected the general in the division, but were a little afraid of him, not without reason. While Berestov could overlook some foibles in his officers and soldiers, he never forgave cowardice. But as we know, not everyone can be brave in every situation. It sometimes happened that the general's wrath was unjust. The driver, who had come upstairs to help, hauled everything downstairs, stuffed it all into bags, and then loaded it onto the sleigh. I slept badly that night. Although I had taken only a few trifling things, in reality I had been no different than the colonel. How easily, in just an hour, did all my lofty principles come crashing down. I vowed that such a thing would never happen again. A few days later, Shilevich, leaving his deputy in charge, rolled off to Poland for 3 days in his personal Willys with a driver. Such absences were frequent for him. He typically described them in the paperwork as trips for medical consultation with some urologist. In reality, his current flame, a captain of the medical services, was located in the second echelon. The staff of the political department knew about everything, but everyone kept silent. An anti-Russian hysteria arose from the first days of our army's march into Germany. The colossal storm it unleashed on the eastern districts of Germany filled the hearts of millions of Germans with terror. Everywhere we saw German leaflets entitled Rotmord, the Red Death, calling upon their soldiers to show no mercy to the Russians. These aren't humans, but creatures, beasts, Asiatic hordes. In return, Ilya Ehrenberg directed his famous leaflet at the Soviet soldier, which thundered, "Kill him! Kill him! That is your mother's request! Kill him! Your child prays! Nothing will bring you more joy than a German corpse!" The front drove ever farther into the heart of East Prussia. We moved forward with constant fighting, marching past hunting lodges of aristocrats, prosperous farming villages, estates, and ancient Prussian castles. We fought our way across water barriers. The Germans, forced to yield cities, towns, and villages to our forces, fell back toward the Baltic Sea. The commanding general of Army Group Centre, Colonel General Hans-Georg Reinhardt, had asked Hitler to evacuate the German civilians in the threatened areas to a safe place well before the crisis erupted. Hitler had refused. The snowy winter and cold spring, with their sharp, cutting winds, and the constant heavy fighting left civilians nowhere to go. The legend of an impenetrable east wall had collapsed. The rapid advance of the Soviet forces, the complete lack of preparation of the civilian population for war on their own territory, and the wild, at times fantastic rumours circulating around the darkest events all led to a massive panicked flight of the civilian population. Thousands of women, old men and children, abandoning their homes, struggled westward like migrating herds. Those who hadn't had time to evacuate fled into the forests and swamps, hiding wherever possible from their inevitable punishment. All this led to the deaths of many thousands of refugees, primarily old people and children. Terrible excesses occurred in East Prussia in the initial frenzy of Goebbels' propaganda, a series of mass suicides. In the Danzig region, soldiers from the 23rd Artillery Division stumbled upon a shed containing 11 children from the ages of 2 to 15 years, and 4 women around 40 years old. Some of their throats had been slashed, while others had slit wrists. Those who were still barely alive refused all medical help, preferring to die than to wind up in Russian hands. A single male named Erwin Schwartz, as it turned out the initiator of this horror, indicated that he had been influenced by instructions from the Nazi Party. Fight with whatever you can and however you can against the Russian troops. Moreover, he had been certain that no one would find out about his role in the slaughter, since rumours would immediately fly around that Russian soldiers had done this to the women and children. On the 19th of January 1945, the People's Commissariat of Defence of the Soviet Union issued an order demanding the cessation of mistreatment of the German population, a halt to the outrages, and the strictest measures against those who were perpetrating them. This Stalin order is evidence that such excesses had been occurring from the very first days of fighting on German soil. The military leadership, following Stalin's instructions, issued their own orders, taking into consideration the realities of the situation. The Soviet army entered East Prussia with a sacred feeling of righteous retribution, but often this feeling turned into blind hatred, and it became almost impossible to stop the massive upwelling of malice, at least in the initial stage of our presence in Germany. Moreover, many officers and political workers were convinced that, after all the evils the Nazis had perpetrated on our soil, the Soviet soldier now in conquered Germany could behave however he wished. Throughout the war, from day to day, we heard the direct and clear-cut slogan, "Kill the German." Reality itself, the inhuman cruelty of the enemy, called us to this act. Propaganda encouraged it, nurturing a sense of vengeance in our soldiers. The works of the best poets, writers and journalists called us to this. Sholokov's The Science of Hatred, Konstantin Simonov's famous verse, "Kill him." Frontline soldiers knew it well and highly regarded it. Alexei Surkov's I Hate and the incendiary essays of Ehrenberg. "Kill the German, kill one, then kill another," Ehrenberg had written. There was an enormous supply of vengeance toward the enemy in his article on hatred. By the end of January 1945, the elements of hatred and revenge had become a raging, inundating river. If we are to be honest, all sorts of things took place. Brutality, sadism, cynical crude acts, unbridled lust, and at times even murders. In this raging storm of retribution, the primary instigators of the violence were the commanders and political workers, the commissary staff, the SMERSH, Soviet counterintelligence agents, and the military commandants. An insignificant portion of the officers sought not to partake in the general madness of violence against people. For example, in Poznan and Heiligenbeil, my comrades saved women from abuse. Individual commanders and political workers who openly protested the outrages against the civilian population suffered for it, among them the later well-known dissident Lev Kopelev. Unfortunately, the Russian press has been concealing the truth about the Red Army's conduct in Germany for more than 60 years. Here's what the 12-volume official history has to say on this subject. Not all Soviet soldiers correctly understood how they should behave in Germany. In the very first days of combat in East Prussia, there were a few incidents of improper conduct. Here's another striking example. In his memoirs, K.K. Rokossovsky wrote, "It must be said that our people demonstrated real humanity and nobility on German soil." Other former Soviet military commanders have written similarly in the same spirit in their memoirs. In 2005, a video conference of Russian and German historians on topical questions of the Second World War took place in Moscow and Berlin. A Russian historian from the State Humanitarian University, Elena Sinyavskaya, who participated in the video conference, declared that the Red Army had never made a formal study of the outrages inflicted on the civilian population in Germany. She acknowledged only isolated cases of inhumane treatment by Soviet servicemen toward the local population, and maintained that those responsible had been fully prosecuted, all the way up to military tribunals. I won't argue with Elena Sinyavskaya or make accusations against her. It's a pointless venture. I'll assume she simply doesn't know the real facts. Fortunately, such declarations receive a sharp rebuke from Western historians. German, American, and English historians, relying upon documentary sources, including Soviet ones, and the testimony of eyewitnesses, have a different understanding of the catastrophe that befell the German population in East Prussia. For example, see the recent books by Anthony Beevor, The Fall of Berlin, 1945, and Max Hastings, Armageddon, The Battle for Germany, 1944-1945. East Prussia, Landsberg, present-day Gorzow Wielkopolski. This city played a dramatic role in the history of our division. By an impetuous drive towards the shores of the Baltic, the forces of Marshal Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front were trying to cut East Prussia off from the rest of Germany. After 14 days of the campaign, the Second Belarusian Front had split the German forces in East Prussia, and by the 26th of January 1945, it had reached the coastal belt of the Baltic Sea. This glittering operation became the shining hour in the life of Konstantin Konstantinovich Rokossovsky. It was his confirmation as a man of firm will and strong mind, and the pinnacle of his ascent as a great military leader, a virtuoso of the art of war. The officers of our division, roused by Rokossovsky's masterful operation, constantly discussed the details of his unfolding campaign. Some considered it to be the finest operation of the entire war. Division Commander Berestov admired the Marshal above all others, and with laughter he liked to relate about his conversations with captured German officers. They tried to find out Rokossovsky's age from me and the academy from which he graduated, but when I told them that the Marshal was 49 and had only a fourth-grade education, that he was the son of a machine operator and had worked as a stonemason, they nearly fainted. As we were completing the operation to cut off the East Prussian group of enemy forces, we approached the town of Landsberg. A railroad, which had major significance for the adversary, passed through the outskirts of Landsberg. It was his only means of escape from the tightening noose of the Red Army around Königsberg. Only a few days, or perhaps hours, remained for Germans to escape the closing pocket. How can it be that for so many years we were called upon to kill the German, but now the High Command is singing a different tune? A few of the more courageous fellows declared even more scathingly, "We trust Ilya Ehrenberg more." We, the officers, knew little about what was going on at the top, far from the front, and relied primarily on news reports, conjectures, and speeches from the top brass who visited the army. But the 14th of April Pravda article criticizing Ehrenberg did not, in fact, change the situation with the excesses in East Prussia. Only on the 20th of April 1945 did the Stavka, or more accurately Stalin, issue Directive 11072 to the front commanders. You are required to change the attitude toward the Germans, both toward military prisoners and toward civilians. Cruel treatment of the Germans only forces them to resist stubbornly and to refuse to surrender. The civilian population, fearing bloody reprisals, is organizing into bands, a Smersh fiction. Such a situation is unfavorable for us. A more humane treatment of the Germans will ease the implementation of our combat operations on their territory. It will also doubtlessly reduce the stubbornness of the Germans on defence. Genuine changes occurred only after the appearance of this directive. The arbitrary treatment of the population began to diminish sharply. Front commanders, military councils, the Army's political directorate, and the division's political departments all worked to implement the Stavka directive. During the time of all the fighting in East Prussia, our division never received any replacements, so it was forced constantly to consolidate regiments and battalions. Before the decisive advance to the shores of the Baltic, the division command had created special assault detachments out of the former regiments and battalions, which were supported by regimental artillery, 76mm and 45mm guns. The detachment, with which I operated, consisted of 100 riflemen divided into 4 groups, with each group having 2 machine guns. A tank brigade moved along the highway ahead of us. Behind our detachment, mortar units with 82mm and 120mm mortars followed. Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack planes covered our detachment from the air. Where had the German aces gone, who just a couple of years before had felt themselves masters of the skies? They were nowhere to be seen. Captured officers confirmed the difficult discussions going on in the enemy camp. Who was in condition to oppose the colossal power of the Russians and organize the basic direction of the forces? How could they close up the ranks of the soldiers if all the officers and soldiers understood that the war was lost? But a dedication to Hitler and their military oath remained in the German army to the very end. Nobody wanted to surrender, to become a Russian prisoner, and nobody believed the promises of our command that we would spare their lives. Tanks crushed them, Katyusha rockets destroyed them, but again and again they rose in our path. Everywhere, on the walls of buildings, on posters, on knife handles, we saw one and the same call: loyalty and fortitude. But what kind of fortitude was there? It was only the howl of despair. In order to stop the resolute advance of the Red Army, by special order of Hitler, young adolescents and old men were summoned into the army and formed into the so-called Volkssturm. Now adolescents who still had no facial hair were sitting behind machine guns or holding Panzerfausts, anti-tank weapons. Most of them had not even reached 16 years of age, but the weapon in their hands still sprayed deadly fire everywhere. These scamps, as we called them, had already burned a lot of our tanks. Our artillerymen would roll up their 76mm guns to fire at point-blank range and smash the embrasures from which they had been firing, but the scamps with their Panzerfausts would just scuttle into the cellars and continue to send out their flaming warheads. We would get to them even there, first with artillery, and then grenades would fly into their hideouts. Only then would they begin to surrender. Gradually, timidly, they would emerge from the cellars with upraised hands. They would look around watchfully or frightenedly, but the adolescent Volkssturm soldiers, down to the last boy, would shout out in Russian a memorized expression, "Hitler kaputt!" We had long become accustomed to such scenes and would laugh. Once I walked up to a surrendering lad of around 15 years of age. The soldier's eyes were red and tearing from lack of sleep, his nose was running, there was a familiar stench, and lice were crawling around his collar. But the boy didn't notice any of these things. He was trembling, and he was afraid to lower his hands without permission. I searched him, found a knife, and then pulled a sheet of paper from the pocket of his coat. It was the oath. I translated it on the spot and read it aloud to the Red Army men around me. I swear by God to fulfill this sacred oath. I will unquestioningly obey the Führer of the German Reich and the German people, Adolf Hitler, the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, and am ready at any moment like a brave soldier to sacrifice my life for this vow. What should we do with such a vile little creature? The detachment commander walked up, grabbed the Volkssturm private, sharply spun him around, and gave him a good kick in the rump with his boot. The lad, without turning around, took off running for the nearby woods like a frightened rabbit. Ahead lay the Baltic Sea. A little more pressure, and the Germans would be trapped with their backs to the sea. They'd have nowhere else to go, and it would become the final situation. Then, at last, everyone could now see the looming victory, the end of the war. Wound up with unaccustomed energy, looking death in the face, our assault unit chased the enemy, taking position after position, always pressing forward. In a fury, the soldier fired burst after burst, shell after shell, from machine guns, submachine guns, and heavy guns. Yet the thoughts were hammering in each soul. It's still going so slowly, just a few kilometers a day. The commanders would rage, "Faster! Forward! Forward!" But bullets and shells know no mercy, and the land around was densely mined. The slightest misstep to the left or right, and you'd be blown sky high. Only by evening would the thunder of battle pause for a short while. Both sides were spent and needed a rest. Wherever the darkness found them, soldiers would collapse to the ground like mown grass. But with the dawn, the cacophony of battle would resume. Again the unpleasant screech of shells, the hoarse sizzle of Panzerfausts, and the heavy return bursts of machine gun and submachine gun fire. But it is impossible to stop the men. Hope is leading us forward. Just a few more hard days, a few more local breakthroughs, a few more desperate efforts, then we'll have them. We'll drive the damned scoundrels into the sea. And then... But how many men were fated to see that day? Heavy casualties by now had reduced our 4 groups of assault detachments into just 2. Those people somewhere in front of us might break contact with us and take to their heels. We have to keep pressing them. The air is heavy, there is no wind, and it is hard to breathe. My throat is parched, and my teeth feel gritty. Sleep no longer comes to us, and we also don't feel like eating. We feel nauseous and unsteady on our feet. We are unwashed, unshaven, in worn-out greatcoats. But the sea lies just ahead. We'll reach it soon. We're just about there. It still isn't visible, but the scent of the sea is in the air. Like an oasis in the desert, each man is dreaming of it and thinking about it every minute, and longs to see it. You begin to believe there is a God, and you ask him fervently, "God, help me make it, God." When we finally emerged from a dense fog, a strong sea breeze instantly, like a knife, parted the veil that had been shrouding the earth, and a mesmerizing image materialized in front of us. The waters of a harbour were shining in the sunlight like an endless golden paradise. Along a narrow beach that stretched for many kilometres around the harbour, thousands of German soldiers were standing with upraised hands, without weapons. These had been placed neatly on the ground in front of them. Around them, along the entire shore, lay piles of corpses in countless numbers, and smashed and abandoned vehicles and equipment, tanks, artillery pieces, field kitchens and wagons. Beyond lay an even more surreal sight. Bobbing on the surface of the sea were the bodies of humans and horses, the skeleton remains of boats and launches, the wreckage of combat vehicles, mutilated trees, torn sheets of newspaper and dead fish, and the entire macabre graveyard was swaying and rocking in the water like some apocalyptic vision. There were thousands of Germans, just dozens of us. Sheer terror and complete confusion were in the eyes of the Germans. Our eyes were shining with joy and a sense of great pride. How much had we sacrificed? How long had we been waiting with growing impatience and fervour for this hour? At last, it was ours. It belonged to us. Victory belonged to us. A tremendous feeling of triumph filled me. I stepped to the front of my unit. For a long time we stood there, our eyes riveted to the shore and to the sea.